Greetings and salutations friends, and welcome back to yet another lore video. In this episode we will be taking a look at the High Elves of Ulthuan, or the Azure as they call themselves, as the High Elves do not recognize the fact that they are divided into three separate factions. The High Elves, Dark Elves, and Wood Elves distinctions is something we mere mortal humans have invented to, well, distinguish between the three. The High Elves consider themselves to be the only proper elves to remain in the world, considering the Dark Elves to be little more than debased demon worshippers, and the Wood Elves of Lauren to be little more than savages, really. The High Elves live primarily on the magical island of Ulthuan that is kept floating by a rather powerful magical spell that is also the spell that, well, is kind of keeping the world from ending, so, important somewhat, and is ruled by the Phoenix King and the Ever Queen. The two rulers are considered more or less equal when it comes to matters of state, although traditionally the Phoenix King holds authority over matters of political and military nature, while the Ever Queen mainly keeps herself busy with cultural, spiritual, and magical pursuits. And the Phoenix King is essentially elected. The High Elves have what is essentially an electoral monarchy, although it is not quite as electoral a monarchy as the Empire. The High Elves elect the new Phoenix King via a council of princes. The exact number of princes is not known, but we can be pretty safe that there is one prince for each of the 10 provinces of Ulthuan, and any number of lesser princes of these provinces. Once the old Phoenix King passes away, the Council of Princes will convene to elect the next king, usually from amongst the princes, and while I do say that it is an electoral monarchy, the wishes of the previous Phoenix King is usually respected, so that the Phoenix King can, in essence, nominate a successor, be it his own child or some other worthy nobleman. As for the Ever Queen, well, she is simply just chosen by the High King, after which they carry out a year-long marriage ceremony, in which the two hump like rabbits for an entire year, producing an heir, or in most cases several, although only the oldest is actually recognized as the potential heir. Now, again, technically, the Phoenix King can choose whomever he pleases. There is no guarantee that the heir is actually going to become the next Phoenix King. He just has a little bit of a shoe-in, so to say. However, after this year-long party of debauchery, each of the rulers, the Phoenix King and the Ever Queen, is free to go off and make woohoo with whomever they so chooses. A tradition that has led to a fair bit of complications, shall we just say, within the High Elven court, leading to the current High Elf court being, well, a mix of drama and politics that is just completely and utterly unequaled in our current world. Imagine a mix between the Russian parliament's batshit insane dictatorial relationships with the completely insane organization of the US Senate and the House of Representatives, with just a dash of the British House of Parliament, and then add in the fact that every single one of those insane crazy-ass politicians, with various goals, motivations, hopes, dreams, and in many cases utterly insane plans, can live for thousands of years. And, well, you're not going to be voting any of them out of office because, well, they're nobles, and as such they just get to be there. So, as you can imagine, the High Elf court is a rather dramatic place, to say the absolute least, to the point where if you have a High Elf army, you get to choose your general. However, before the battle, you've got to roll a dice to see whether your general will actually get to be the general, or whether or not some courtly intrigue has displaced him from the generalship, which in the worst case scenario could have your relatively low leadership mage deciding that, well, I've got an uncle who knows a person that knows the sister of the current Phoenix King, and therefore I'm now the boss. So shut it. So yeah, I'm not even going to attempt to unravel the intricacies of the Phoenix Court, as well the information we have on it is contradictory at best. So instead I'm going to move on to the diplomatic relations of the High Elves, if such a race could actually be said to have diplomatic relations. You see, the High Elves considered themselves to be vastly superior to, well, everybody, in many cases even other High Elves. And they consider the vast majority, or, well, who am I kidding, they consider all of the races of the old world to be little more than hut-dwelling barbarians that are far too busy with bashing each other over the head with wooden instruments to pay any attention to the real threat of chaos. And so the High Elves considered themselves the world's one and only protection against the ravages of chaos. They could be called, without, well, any sarcasm really, to be the world police of the Warhammer world. Although, you've got to also realize that their sense of policing is based entirely around what is best for Ulthuan, as, well, who the hell cares about the hut-dwelling barbarians, right? Anyways, moving back to their political ties, they are technically allied with the Empire, Bretonnia, and Kislev, and, well, they maintain tenuous relationship of friendship with the dwarves, although you'd be hard-pressed to find a dwarf actually willing to admit to that fact, and equally hard-pressed to find a high elf willing to admit that fact. Although, even though I do say that they are allied and do maintain technically political relationships with these factions, they don't really. They maintain a one-way street of communication. The High Elves get to talk to the Empire, to Bretonnia and Kislev, when they so choose, but the nations of the humans do not necessarily get to talk back to the High Elves. And the reason for this is pretty damn simple. It is the fact that the High Elves do not allow any foreigners to take even so much as a single step into Ulthuan. Or, well, that is not entirely correct, because the current Phoenix King, Finubar the Seafarer, having travelled the great swaths of the old world, came to realize that the humans were not quite the hut-dwelling barbarians that they thought them, and has, as such, allowed the humans to enter a single city within the High Elf Kingdom of Ulthuan. They are graciously allowed to enter the city of Lothran. And in some occasions they may also be allowed to trade with the High Elves, although this is mostly done as a sort of show of friendship and, putting up with the mud-eating barbarians, rather than an actual trade agreement. Essentially, the High Elves have realized that trade ties bring prosperity to both nations, and is, as such, considered a good thing by the humans of the old world, and so it is tolerated by the Elves of Ulthuan, although they would never deign to actually trade anything of value with the humans. But base commodities like wine, textiles, and that kind of stuff? Okay, fine. And primarily just to keep the mud-eating barbarians happy. All that being said, though, the High Elves are not all bad. They did, after all, save the world from the original coming of chaos, and have fought against chaos in all of its forms throughout their history. They have aided the men of the Empire and Bretonnia on several occasions, so, they do try to help. It's just that they don't always help in quite the way that the other races of the old world would want them to, and, well, they will happily betray their allies if they see some kind of merit in it. And they will not hesitate to attack even their allies should they find some kind of excuse or political snub for doing so, and they will take ruthless vengeance on anyone and anyone nearby if they were to be attacked. A good example of this is the sacking of the human city of Marienburg. And what prompted this, you might ask? Why did the High Elves decide to attack and burn down a considerable part of one of the Empire's largest trading cities, although I'd hasten to point out that it had already gained its independence at this point, so this didn't trigger a proper war with the actual Empire? Well, I'll tell you. Of course I will. You know how much I love to ramble. Anyways, the pirate Otto Steinrott, the infamous pirate of the Red Pirates of Marienburg, and yes, I know, I just said pirate a lot of times, and I will try to stop saying pirate. So, the pirates of Otto Steinrott, the pirate, happened upon the Isle of Ulthuan and, by some strange coincidence, managed to get past all of the magical barriers that usually hide the island behind an eternal mist. His ships prowled along the coast and came upon the city of Sardenath. And being pirates and being presented with what was essentially a completely and utterly unguarded city filled with pansy-ass civilians and stacked to the rafters with all manners of awesome artifacts that could be sold for quite the pretty penny back in Marienburg, naturally they attacked. However, the High Elven Sea Lord, Aislinn, was warned of this, and while his fleet did not arrive in time to aid the city of Sardenath, he was not going to let the pirates escape unmolested. But here is where the High Elven act of proper cuntishness actually steps in. The High Elf Sea Lord could at practically any time have actually caught up to the pirate fleet, laden down with treasure as it was, and sunk it at a high sea, boarding the ships, taking back their treasure, and returning to Ulthuan. The only ones that would have been killed were the pirates and a few High Elves. And it would, all in all, have been a rather minor event. However, the High Elven Sea Lord decided that this wasn't quite enough, and so he decided to follow the pirates back to their port of origin, which so happened to be the city of Marienburg. Now, of course, the city of Marienburg has no real control over these pirates. They don't ban their activities, they don't actively chastise them, but they don't command them. In some cases, the merchant princes of Marienburg do hire them to carry out certain missions, yes, but there is nothing suggesting that this was the case. But Aislinn didn't much care for this fact and decided that, well, the pirates came here, so, well, let's just attack the entire bloody city, shall we? And so that is exactly what he did. He attacked the city of Marienburg under cover of a magical mist, which protected his fleet from the sea-facing batteries of great cannons protecting Marienburg. The elves sailed straight into the port of Marienburg and set about burning down, well, everything in the port. Not just the pirates, but civilian vessels, merchant vessels, warships, anything they could lay their hands on, really. And once they were done, having retrieved most of their treasure, they retreated and decided that, well, we've screwed up most of the infrastructure of the city. Let's finish the deal by summoning a bunch of fire elementals along the port, which burned down considerable parts of the city of Marienburg. So, in essence, a small elven city had been raided by pirates, and then the High Elves had decided to attempt to destroy the entire city that the pirates returned home to. A somewhat extreme action, to say the least, that left far more High Elves and humans dead on both sides than would ever have been actually necessary. And for this, Aislinn was chastised rather severely upon returning to Ulthuan, but he wasn't outright condemned. As well, after all, the only thing he'd really done was burn down the mud huts of a lot of savage barbarians, right? So, don't need to be too pissy about it. So, yeah, High Elven diplomacy is, in most cases, a one-way street, although, having mentioned the sack of Marienburg, I also feel it's only fair to mention that they have helped out the humans on several occasions too. They did send armies to fight against the hordes of chaos, both during the first and second Storm of Chaos in the Imperial calendar, and they have on several occasions helped Bretonnia against ravaging beastmen warband. So it's not like they're all bad, it's just that you really can't be painting them as the good guys either. Moving on, I figured we should probably cover the High Elf religions. The High Elves worship two distinct pantheons of gods. One they call the Kedai, and the other they call the Kitharai. Where the Kedai are the good guys, they are the gods of productivity, harvest, love, crafting, motherhood, farming, and all of these wonderful cuddly things. And the Kitharai are the gods of, horrible things. War, torture, rape, that kind of stuff. Because, of course, the elves have a god of rape, because, why the hell not? And I'd like to point out that, you gotta remember that the High Elves, back way in the mists of time, created their own gods. So, on some occasion, a High Elf decided that, we need a god of rape. And if that doesn't speak volumes about the High Elven mindset, then I don't know what does. In general, though, the High Elves openly worship the Kedai, the Good Elves, and try to appease some of the Kitharai. For example, they somewhat worship Cain, the god of war, although in this case he's less of a proper god of war, just, warriors and that stuff, and more a god of bloodshed. Many have argued that he might be a lesser embodiment of Khorne, although being an originally created elven god and having elven avatars, in fact the High Elf hero and Aryan defender did call upon his very power to defeat chaos, I think it's relatively safe to say that he is a separate deity. And while the High Elves themselves consider themselves completely and utterly immune to the warping influence of chaos, which has been proven on quite a few occasions to not be entirely true, but oh well, the High Elves have never let something so insignificant as the truth get between themselves and their pride. They have on occasion been known to worship the Chaos deities, primarily Slaanesh and Khorne, considering Khorne to be just another aspect of Cain. Although in current-day Ulthuan, the worship of Cain is accepted, albeit frowned upon, the worship of any of the proper gods of chaos like Slaanesh is completely and utterly outlawed, which is probably a good thing considering it was one of the reasons why the High Elves got sundered in the first place, but we'll get to that relatively soon. Now, I figured the way I was going to do this video, he says after rambling on for about, 20 minutes? Oh well, I got there eventually. I'll do a quick little piece on the homeland of the High Elves, Ulthuan, as it is quite important, and then I'll go through the various Phoenix Kings, because it seems like the best way to give you a general overview of the history and the lore of the High Elves. So, starting with Ulthuan itself. Ulthuan, as you see before you, is divided into 10, kingdoms, essentially, or provinces, if you will, each ruled over by a prominent noble. You have the province of Tiranoc, the home of the great Tiranoc charioteers. You have the Shadowlands, formerly known as Nagoreth, the home of the Dark Elves. They are not, well, let's just say that the rest of the High Elves are slightly suspicious of the Elves from the Shadowlands, although they are, as far as anyone can determine, loyal to the cause of the Phoenix King. Then you have Kreis, or Schreis, or Chreis, or what the fuck ever that is supposed to be pronounced as, the home of the White Lions, a band of elite high elves wielding two-handed axes, and are considered to be the bodyguards of the Phoenix King. Then there is Kothikwe, a coastal realm whose main industries involve shipping, trade, and fishing. They are wonderful shipwrights and have provided considerable amounts of the High Elf fleet's strength. Then there is the most sparsely populated of all the elven provinces, Ivres, which is ruled by Eltharion the Grim, one of the most broken-ass OP characters in the entirety of the Warhammer universe, only overshadowed by an even more broken High Elf in the form of Tyrion, the potentially biggest, baddest, most broken-ass special character in the history of Warhammer. Moving on to the inner kingdoms, we have Caledor, the proudest and most martial of all the High Elf realms, and also the home to the Caledor Dragon Princes, and the place where many of the mighty dragons snooze away their days until they are awakened for war. And also, as the name suggests, the home of some of the more famous, and in some cases more retarded, Phoenix Kings. Then we move on to Averlorn, which is the home of the Ever Queen, a lush forested land home to many mythical creatures like unicorns, Pegasus, giant eagles, and, of course, this being elves, fairies, and is considered a bit of a luxury retreat by the elves. Then we've got Illyrian, the home of the Horse Lords, Loire, a province of wide open plain said to be the home of the greatest horsemen in all of Ulthuan, if not all the world, if the High Elves are to be believed. Then we have Safari, the home of the Tower of Hoeth and all of its many magical orders, and is considered to be the hub of all knowledge, wisdom, and magical know-how within the island of Ulthuan, and is also the ancestral home of the famous sword masters of Ulthuan. Last of the inner kingdoms we have Eataine, in which the great seaport of Lothran, the only place where humans or other merchants are allowed to actually visit, although they are not allowed to travel on beyond Lothran, and even then Lothran was only actually opened to foreigners relatively recently under the Phoenix King Finubar the Seafarer. And it is also home to the quite famous Lothran Sea Guard, one of the most bullshit units in the entire game, as they have bows, but they also have shields and spears, making them rather ridiculously versatile. Then in the Inner Sea we have the Isle of the Dead, which is the center of the Great Vortex, which is gathering magic from all over the world, and the Isle of Flames, which holds the Shrine of Assyrian, where new Phoenix Kings are elected, technically, and crowned. Although I hasten to note that neither of these islands are considered to be part of any one realm. Now, I should also probably touch upon the Isle of the Dead and the great magical vortex housed within it. During one of the original Chaos incursions, the world was very, very, very close to being completely overrun by the powers of Chaos. To stop this, one of the greatest High Elf mages of all times, Caledor Dragon Tamer, began a massive spell to start and harness all of the power of the Chaos incursions. He constructed via magical means a series of magical waystones all across Ulthuan. These waystones gather the powers of Chaos, turning it inwards towards the Isle of the Dead, centering it in one location, and using the very powers of Chaos to gather all of the powers of Chaos into one spot, and from that one spot dissipate it harmlessly. Essentially, the Isle of the Dead is a magical vortex, sucking in all the world's chaotic energies, gathering it up, and harmlessly neutralizing it. It is this very magical construct that has actually saved the world from just simply becoming a realm of chaos. And without it, well, there would be no Warhammer world. And so, for all their haughty, arrogant nature, the High Elves are, in fact, the only reasons why the old world exists, and you can bet your shiny little ass that they will never ever stop reminding us of that particular fact. With that covered, I figured I'd move on to the various Phoenix Kings, and I'll just give you a brief overview of all of them up till the current day and Finubar the Seafarer, and no, I will not be covering Malekith, because F all of that shit. F every last page of the End Times book. All of it. Every last tiny bit of it. And after the Isle of the Dead, I should probably also talk about the Isle of Flames and the Shrine of Asuryan, and why Phoenix Kings are taken there to be crowned. Well, here's the thing. You see, when the High Elves elect one of their new Phoenix Kings, he has to go to the Shrine of Asuryan and step through the magical flames of Asuryan. Asuryan is essentially the boss of all of the High Elves gods, the Zeus or Odin of the High Elf pantheon. And by passing through his flames, the Phoenix King-to-be essentially puts himself under the scrutiny of the gods, where they can go like, okay, this is a good guy, or no, this guy's a bad guy, let's turn him into charcoal and burn him half to death, or hopefully to death, although that has not always been so successful. Essentially, if a High Elven Phoenix King is able to pass into the flames and emerge on the other side unscathed, he is essentially considered to have been accepted by the gods, and therefore it's perfectly okay to make him the Phoenix King. Now, of course, in the End Times, all of this was turned into complete bullshit, like everything the End Times touched, and essentially meant that, oh, no, Malekith wasn't burned by the flames because he wasn't worthy. No, the gods just wanted to fuck with him a little bit, and stared most of his body away, thinking like, ha, it's a practical joke. Except, burning to death, Malekith steps out of the flames rather than stay there and burn to death, which surprised the gods somehow. We expected him to just, stay there and burn. And so after that, they didn't bother judging any of the other Phoenix Kings, The gods decided that, well, we fucked up with that one Malekith guy, so let's just ignore all of the previous people instead of, giving them a hint or anything. God, I hate the End Times. Anyways, having covered that, I figured I'd move on to the various Phoenix Kings and give you a quick by my standards anyway, overview of their lore and how the Kingdom of the High Elves have actually evolved throughout their history. So, naturally, we will start out with Anarion the Defender, the very first of the Phoenix Kings, and, technically not elected Phoenix King. He kinda made himself Phoenix King, details. Anyways, Anarion was the first of the hero kings, so to say, as well. He essentially saved the world from chaos. During a series of Deus Ex Machina plot twists, the frankly rather shoddily constructed polar warp gates exploded and unleashed chaos upon the world. This took the form of the first Chaos Incursion. Now, the timeline here is jumbled, let's just say, and I think we can accept that most of this stuff is, mythical history rather than, actual history. And it begins with a demon invasion of Ulthuan. Anarion went to the Shrine of Asuryan and did all of the things that religious people do in times like these, giving sacrifices, giving prayers, all kind of wonderfulness, until finally he said that he would sacrifice himself to save his people, and doing this, he leapt into the flames of Anarion. Of course, we both now know that leaping into the flames of Anarion basically just means that you're going to be tested, and unless the gods decide to pull a practical fucking joke on you for some magical reason, you get to go out on the other side completely unharmed. And now, since he essentially embodied the essence of a god, he gained previously unknown magical powers, allowing him to kill a demon lord, which was leading the host of demons invading Ulthuan, with a single spear throw that must have crossed a few hundred meters of ground, if not bloody kilometers, killing the demon instantly. So that was rather anticlimactic. But the demons were not quite through with just that. Together with the great high elven mage Kalidor Dragon Tamer, Anarion forged a ton of magical doodahs in a remarkable short time, considering he did this in, well, hours, if not days, popped out with these newfound weapons, distributed them amongst the princes of the land, and armed with these new magical Deus Ex Machina thingy-bobs, went off to beat off the demon horde. Now, already you can probably see that this stuff is not particularly well described, and, well, yeah, it's not. This is quite literally the information at our disposal, which is why I think we should judge it as myths rather than hardcore history, albeit myths with a core of truth. Anyways, moving on, Anarion decided that he had had enough of all of this and went off to marry his beloved queen, becoming then the first ever queen. And with her, he sired the sons Morelian and the daughter Ivrain. But again, in a slight interesting little twist of continuity, apparently the second Chaos Incursion happened shortly after, so considering the pregnancy period for elves is considered longer than that of humans, I'm wondering how the hell he had time for all of this, but again, myth, so. Anyways, the second Chaos Incursion was considerably larger than the first one. And somehow, magically, during the invasion of Ulthuan, Anarion's wife and children were not evacuated for some mystical reason, and they were killed by the demons, driving Anarion into a vengeful rage. He went to a place called the Blighted Isle, where the shrine of the elven god of war, Cael Menshikain, was located, and upon a altar within this shrine lay pieces of the war god's sword. This, of course, was a rather powerful artifact, crafted when the elves were able to control their gods. And it was said that if you'd ever pick it up, you would be infused with the power of Cael Menshikain, the war god, but he would also slowly start taking over your mind, corrupting you piece by piece. But at this point, Anarion figured, screw it. So he went off, he picked up the sword, and, predictably enough, he did go ever so slightly insane, but he also became massively OP in the bargain, allowing him to kill entire armies of demons quite literally single-handedly, which makes the fact that he struggled against just two greater demons a bit later on in the story ever so slightly suspect, but again, myth. However, picking up the sword of the god of brutal slaughter had of course some ever so slight effects upon Anarion, as it drove him completely insane and he over time became a ruthless tyrant, to the point where his closest ally, Kalidor Dragon Tamer, decided that he would leave and found his own kingdom of elves. This naturally annoyed Anarion ever so slightly, but before he could gather his host and started the first Elven Civil War, the third Chaos Invasion began, and again, we don't really have the faintest how much time passed. According to the Elven Chronicles, it would appear that all of this took place in a single goddamn weekend, but I'm assuming that that might be slightly exaggerated. Back to the point again, though. You might now assume that seeing as Anarion had little to no problems beating off the demon horde last time, this latest incursion shouldn't prove much of a problem, but no. According to the elven scripture, there were so many demons that even Anarion, who previously was just beating the demons up with each other at this point, somehow couldn't just kill them all. Myth again. But all of this, of course, led to the magical doodah of the Vortex, where Kalidor Dragon Tamer figured that, well, we can't just keep taking on endless invasions of demons. Sooner or later, we are going to run out of dudes, especially considering all of this apparently took place over the course of a bloody weekend. So he began the construction, I suppose, of a great magical circle, designed to create a vortex of magic, and this then became the Isle of the Dead. Using a network of magical waystones, he channeled the raw power of chaos in the form of magic into this network, forcing it together into a single point in the center of Ulthuan, and then returning it to a realm of chaos. This had two effects. First of all, the magical energies that were keeping the polar warp gates open dissipated to such an extent that they could barely be considered to be open anymore, and secondly, because of the lack of magical energy suffusing the world, the demons no longer possessed their full power, and now they were facing an even angrier Anarian than previously. And so, Anarian, with a handful of his finest drinking buddies, beat up what little remained of the Chaos Army in, again, what appears to be mere hours. Considering the High Elves were on the verge of defeat moments previously, okay, again, myth. It seems a little bit odd, but, oh well, he did it. However, in this case, the Deus Ex Machina demands that he was heavily wounded in the process, because, well, he was clearly starting to get proper batshit insane, so, he's gotta die now, and so he did. Using the last strength of his loyal dragon, Anarian flew once more back to the shrine of Caelan and Chicane, where he embedded the magical sword within the rock of the altar, making sure that no one could draw it again, although of course he left a prophecy that, as like all bloody rulers in the history of ever, I shall return should my people need me and all of that nonsense. And of course in the end times the dude just popped out of the goddamn woodwork, but we don't talk about the end times here, now do we? So, yeah, that was an Aryan Defender. Now, if you want to read the proper lore-heavy version, I would strongly suggest that you pop over to the Lexicanum, although, again, take it all with a pinch of salt, as during the course of my little research for this video, I found about 5 different versions and timelines as to this, so, yeah. I'm not going to be arguing which is the correct one, but just using good old-fashioned logic, you've got to assume that, essentially, this was a time during which the powers of kings were running rampant through the world, and so all magic was increased to absolutely insane levels. Meaning that if an Aryan somehow did manage to possess the fraction of the power of a god, he could quite potentially have cut through entire legions of demons in mere seconds, as he was at that point essentially a god. But yeah, take all of that with just a grain of salt. Moving on, we have the successor of Anarian, the first properly elected Phoenix King, Belshazzar. Belshazzar was a wise and just ruler, and under him began a great era of expansion and prosperity. Although, ironically, he was also to be essentially the undoing of the High Elves as a single race. Under his reign, the Elves established several colonies in the New World as well as the Old World, and scattered out over much of the Warhammer world, building ports and naval stations all across the world. And he also befriended the Dwarf High King Snorri Whitebeard, swearing an oath of eternal friendship between elf and dwarf. But Belshazzar was to be destined to be famous not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. Under his reign, the so-called pleasure cult started spreading throughout High Elven society. This cult pretended to be simply a society of luxurious elves enjoying life, but in reality it was something far darker, as it was a cult dedicated to the chaos god Slanesh. But even more problematic than that was someone that was to become quite infamous, namely the son of Anarian, Malekith. You see, after having his wife brutally murdered by demons after not giving the order to, evacuate the poor lady, Anarian figured he'd drown his sorrows in the bosom of whatever elf female was closest at hand, and so he sired a son, Malekith, with the elf sorceress Morathi, which later would go on to be one of the leaders of the Cult of Pleasure. Now, Malekith was not a bad person to begin with. He was an elven prince. He wanted what was best for Ulthuan, until the creators of Warhammer fantasy lore decided to turn him into a second Horus. Again, end times. Anyways, Malekith found a magical artifact, let's just say. This magical artifact showed him a glimpse of the future, and of course, well, the Chaos Gods did not outright lie, but they forgot to mention that the reason the future was such dark was because of Malekith's action, which, again, Horus Heresy, but oh well. Malekith decided that he was to become the proper Phoenix King because he was the only one who could lead his people out and away from this catastrophe. But sadly, when his daddy died, the Council of Princes elected not him, but Belshazzar. Realizing that he had little to gain from arguing at this point, Malekith pretended to approve of Belshazzar and pretended to be helping him out in various ways, gaining his trust. And he even betrayed his own mother, as when the cults of pleasure were revealed to be mere worship of Slaanesh, he condemned his mother Morathi, one of the leaders of the cult of pleasure, and began a ruthless witch hunt throughout the elven nations, or at least so it appeared. In truth, he was not hunting for worshippers of the cult of pleasure. No, he was using his newfound position as High Inquisitor to arrest and silently depose of anyone that might stand against his elevation to Phoenix King. In his final act, he accused Belshazzar of being a secret worshipper of Slaanesh, and before Belshazzar could argue against these accusations, he died after having been poisoned shortly before the announcement of him being a worshipper of Slaanesh was revealed. The good old-fashioned, "Here, Lord, drink this," in all its glory. Having disposed of Belshazzar, Malekith figured that all he had to do was walk into the sacred flame and be crowned Phoenix King. Unfortunately, Asuryan did not agree with his assessment of the situation and horribly burned him and threw him from the flames. Now, again, in the end times, we realize that all of this was merely just a practical joke because Asuryan is a bit of a douchebag, but oh well. I shan't be touching too much more on that. Anyways, Malekith was carried off to safety by his followers, who were equally shocked that their shining liege lord was not instantly accepted as the next Phoenix King. But, of course, merely being burned half to death in magical flames is not enough to dissuade Malekith from his goals. Still convinced that he was to be the next Phoenix King, and that the flames must have been some mistake, probably engineered by the late Belshazzar himself, decided that he would take the throne by force if he could not take it by ritual. And so began the events of the Great Sundering, the great elf civil war which rages to this day, and again, no end times, shh, go away. And Malekith may very well have succeeded with his plans to take the throne by force, were it not for one of the few remaining princes that Malekith had not either tortured to death, imprisoned, poisoned, killed off, betrayed, or otherwise inconvenienced. Elected from amongst the remaining princes, Caledor I began to fight back against Malekith and defeated him in several open-pitched battles. However, again, Malekith was not to be thwarted so easily, and he decided that he might be able to threaten Ulthuan, or at the very least, if he couldn't have it, he would make sure that nobody else had it as well. Being a mage of incredible potency, Malekith, now known as the Witch King after being incarcerated in his black armor, interferes with the vortex of chaos energy in the center of Ulthuan, threatening to plummet Ulthuan below the sea. In preparation for this, he cast a spell of massive magical power, binding parts of the vortex infinite energy within the massive fortresses of his loyal allies, creating the Black Arcs, massive floating fortresses, and ripping them directly from the land of Ulthuan. However, the ritual was not fully completed, and Ulthuan was only partially submerged, with the fortresses of Naggaroth having torn themselves away from Ulthuan and large parts of Tiranoc being submerged. However, the High Elves were not willing to give up the fight just yet, and so the Dark Elves resumed their war against Ulthuan. Calidor, realizing that this war would not be lost nor won anytime soon, began the construction of the gateway fortresses of the north, great bastion gates to defend against invasion from Naggaroth. And once the construction of the Griffin Gate, the first of these fortresses, was completed, he used it as a solid bastion from which to launch raids against the forces of Naggaroth, finally driving the Witch King off to sea on his black arcs, leaving Ulthuan behind. Calidor orders an expedition to the Blighted Isles, a island chain off the coast of the new Naggaroth, the home of the Dark Elves, hoping that he might be able to kill off the remaining Dark Elves. Unfortunately, the forces massed against him were too great, and after establishing a stronghold, planning to use it for further expeditions against the Dark Elves on the Blighted Isles, Calidor sails for Ulthuan. However, on the journey, his ship, Indraugnir, named after the great dragon of Venerian, is separated from the rest of the fleet and is assaulted by Dark Elf raiders. Calidor, choosing to take his own life rather than being captured, throws himself overboard in full armor, thereby ending his own reign, rather than being captured by the Dark Elves, which was probably a pretty good idea. What wasn't such a good idea, however, was appointing his son, Calidor II, as the next Phoenix King, because where his father was wise and tempered and, intelligent, his son was a bit of a bastard, to say the absolute least. I think we might even use the bitch word for this particular character. He managed to destroy pretty much everything his father had built, and he managed to do most of this while lazying around doing next to nothing. And you know that you are truly gifted with the ability to destruction if you can tear down an entire kingdom from the luxury of your hunting cabin. As to how he managed this, well, Malekith has to take part of the blame, as at this point he figured that the best way to undermine the strength of Ulthuan was to strike at their allies. He sent several parties of scouts into the old world to attack dwarven trade columns and dwarven dignitaries, assassinating them and leaving proof that it was indeed the High Elves who had done this, because the High Elves, in their arrogance, had decided not to tell the dwarves that they were in the midst of a civil war, and that their enemies might try to screw with them. The dwarves, naturally enough, being slightly miffed about the fact that their trade caravans were being attacked by their closest allies, sent several dignitaries to the High Elves, but they were not heeded. Eventually, breakaway factions of the dwarves initiated a small-scale war against some of the smaller High Elf settlements closer to the World's Edge Mountains. The High Elves themselves took this as an outright declaration of war, and Calidor II himself set off to the Old World to teach the stunty-haired, bearded little bastards a lesson in civility. Confronting a relatively small force of the separatist dwarves, led by the High King's son, Snorri Halfhand, Calidor II was challenged to a duel by said dwarfs Snorri Halfhand, and in a rather short and extremely one-sided duel, Calidor killed the young dwarf prince. And with his task completed, Calidor II withdrew from the field, assuming that the spirits of the dwarves were broken. Now, anyone that knows the dwarfs would realize that this would only cause even further grudges and even further problems, but Calidor II, viewing the dwarves as little more than cave-dwelling barbarians, did not think that this war would last much longer now that he had killed a single dwarf, albeit a noble. With this in mind, Calidor II returned to Ulthuan and the comforts of his hunting cabins. However, the wise dwarven High King Gotrek Starbreaker, although enraged at the careless death of his son, attempted one last time to ensure peace with the High Elves. He dispatched several ambassadors with demands of recompense and apologies be made. At this point, the war was pretty much a fact, and it was not to be the short, punishing expedition that Calidor II had planned. To give you a bit of perspective, Calidor II killed Snorri Halfhand in the year 1974 BC, or before Sigmar, technically, Imperial calendar. And the war ended in 1601 by the same calendar. After the war had raged for hundreds of years, Calidor II decided that his generals must all be incompetent, and decided to once again pop over to the old world and finish things once and for all. Unfortunately for Calidor, this time he was not facing a dwarven prince, he was facing Gotrek Starbreaker himself. And in an equally brief and one-sided duel, the dwarf killed Calidor II and took the Phoenix Crown as recompense for all the wrongs the elves had heaped upon the dwarves. With this, Gotrek considered the war against the elves ended, as he had burned the vast majority of their colonies in the old world and had taken the lives of their leaders, and had claimed the Phoenix Crown as payment. And so, the dwarves retreated to their near-impregnable mountain holds. The next Phoenix King, Caradril, realizing that the war with the dwarves was not going anywhere, asked for peace. The dwarves, on their side, considered the matter done with. They considered the war already over, so they didn't quite understand why the elves were asking for peace. And while these diplomatic niceties continued, the engineer of this entire war, Malekith, finally made his move, launching a massive attack upon Ulthuan, landing several of his massive black arcs upon the northern shores. With peace, more or less de facto concluded with the dwarfs though, Caradril the Peacemaker made efforts to retrieve the Phoenix Crown through diplomatic means, but all requests to have it returned to them were met with a cordial "na na 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 na, you can't have it" by the dwarfs. Slightly miffed by this less than entirely respectful response, Caradril briefly considered laying siege to Karasa Karak and attempting to take it by force, although such a venture would probably not have gotten them very far, with their armies as depleted as they were. But in the end he decided against it, considering the Dark Elves to be a considerably greater threat to Ulthuan than the dwarves being in possession of the Phoenix Crown. The Dark Elf incursion was held in check by the massive gate fortresses, and Caradril died peacefully. The Dark Elves were not able to penetrate far enough into Ulthuan, and eventually were forced to retreat, leaving only relatively minor garrisons in the northern parts of Ulthuan. Caradril's successor was Tethlis the Slayer, as he was known. His rule was marked first of all by the weakening of the powers of magic in the world, which forced many of the great dragons to begin their essentially eternal slumber. Tethlis realized that with the slumbering of the dragons, the High Elves' armies were much weakened, and began a systematic militarization of elven society, forming the elven citizen militia. Essentially, he made it so that every elf had to serve in the citizen militia, making every single elf an archer or a spearman should he be required to fight. And launches in 956 before Sigmar the so-called Scouring, where he leads massive armies of citizens militia out against the Dark Elves, which will eventually drive all the Dark Elves back off Ulthuan. During the next few hundred years, Tethlis inflicts several crushing defeats on the Dark Elves' armies until in 702 Imperial calendar he finally drives the last of the Dark Elves out of Ulthuan once more. However, during one of the final battles of this conflict, Tethlis is killed under mysterious circumstances in a sea battle, and is followed by the next Phoenix King, Bel-Qurhadris. Not all that much is known about Bel-Qurhadris. What we know is he began the construction of the White Tower of Hoeth in an attempt to organize the remaining mages of the High Elves and make them into an effective weapon. Much like what Tethlis did for the citizen militia, Bel-Qurhadris set out to create a magical militia. And he also formed the Order of the Sword Masters of Hoeth, elite High Elf warriors wielding great weapons that dedicate the entirety of their millennia-long lives in the pursuit of perfection in the arts of swordsmanship. Additionally, the Swordmasters have a dual purpose. They are not merely bodyguards and guardians of the Tower of Hoeth, they are also inquisitors in the secret war against the Cult of Pleasure, rooting out its followers and brutally killing them off wherever they might find them. Next up is Aethys the Poet. The poet continued Bel-Qurhadris' example and became a great patron of the magical arts, reinforcing the status of the White Tower of Hoeth as the premier institute for magic not only in Ulthuan, but really in the world. Under his reign, he attempted to bring back a measure of stability and peace to Ulthuan. Unfortunately, he brought back a bit too much, causing a resurgence of the Cult of Pleasure, and he was eventually killed by a Nagarothian spy, who up until that point had been considered one of his closest advisors, and was probably the reason why the Cult of Pleasure was so close to re-establishing its grip over the High Elves. The man who revealed the Nagarothian assassin was Morvill, the then High Master of the Tower of Hoeth, and he was rewarded for his service by being crowned the next Phoenix King. But sadly, Morvill was a scholar. He was not a warrior nor a statesman, and his first act was to order a punitive strike against Nagaroth to avenge Aethys' murder. Unfortunately, this was, to say the least, a predictable response, and the armies of the High Elves were massacred as they made landfall on the shores of Nagaroth. And now, after having squandered large parts of the High Elven military force, Morrowill had left his realm almost defenseless against the Dark Elves, who took this proffered invitation as the perfect opportunity to relaunch hostilities. However, you've got to give the Lawmaster some credit, as he realized that he was a moron and appointed an actual warrior to be his commander of forces, Menethus of Caledor. Morrowill set about establishing a system of citizens' levies and rebuilding the High Elf army, draining the treasury to near empty, rebuilding the navy, and setting up a network of swordmasters in their inquisitorial role to clear out what was left of the Cult of Pleasure within Ulthuan. And while the Dark Elves had succeeded in taking back parts of northern Ulthuan, they were stopped at the Griffin Gate, one of the greatest great fortresses of the High Elves. And with the new citizen levies at his command, Menethus led them out against the Witch King's forces and forced them back into a single fortress named Anlek. However, again, Morval was not a warrior. Plagued by his earlier failure, the mounting casualty reports being sent back from the siege of Anlek, he eventually decided that the realm could not bear a Phoenix King like him, and committed ritual suicide upon hearing that his Warmaster Menethus had also fallen in the assault on Anlek. The siege was successful, however, and the Dark Elves were driven back off Ulthuan. At this point, the elven princes responsible for electing the Phoenix Kings had gotten just a wee bit skeptical about the abilities of others to lead their nation. After the rather catastrophic reigns of Aethys and Morvill, and so elected Bel-Hathor the Sage, because they figured that he was a relatively low noble and could be easily manipulated. However, Bel-Hathor proved to be one of those rare rulers that actually had a talent for ruling, becoming a ruler as famed for his resolve as for his wisdom. His most notable action, perhaps, was his refusal to invade Naggaroth after the victory at Anlek, realizing that the Dark Elves were probably not beat, and that they High Elves themselves had suffered dearly for driving them out of their homeland, and could just not risk another catastrophic landing on the shores of Naggaroth, a landing that the Dark Elves were sure to be expecting. Instead, he elected to further reinforce Ulthuan's defenses, constructing a system of magical wards around Ulthuan, which brought into being a magical mist around the continent, confusing would-be seafarers and invaders, and messing with their navigational instruments, as well as obscuring even the heavens from their view. Bel-Hathor was also the first Phoenix King to completely forbid all foreigners even so much as the slightest access to the Isles of Ulthuan, partially because he still did not want the rest of the world to realize that the elves were at war with themselves, although at this point it was one of the worst kept secrets in the Warhammer world, but High Elves are ever so slightly full of themselves at the best of times. He did, however, dispatch Finubar, the future Phoenix King, to the Old World to assess whether or not the primitive barbarians of the Old World could be in some way useful to the elves. During his travels, Finubar found that the savage mud-eating barbarians were not quite as savage as the High Elves had originally thought, making Bel-Hathor rescind his decree that Ulthuan be kept free of all foreigners, and allowed the city of Lothran to be a free city where trade and politics might flow reasonably freely. And with this trade, and being free of the Dark Elves, Ulthuan experienced a long period of peace, with Bel-Hathor dying of old age, the second Phoenix King to do so, being succeeded by Finubar the Seafarer, his elected successor. Finubar, being the current High Elf Phoenix King, is a little bit unique, as he actually thinks that the other races of the world might actually be of some use in the war against chaos, although he has still to realize the very simple fact that if he just told the humans that the elves raiding their borders, raiding their coastal settlements, are Dark Elves rather than High Elves, it would greatly help his diplomatic process, at some point maybe he will realize. But well, considering he is still remarkably liberal for a High Elf, and under him the High Elven kingdoms have prospered, and has actually managed to re-establish a bit of trust between the High Elves and the Dwarves to a certain degree. Not much, but it's a start. And should he ever decide to actually try and do something against the Dark Elves, he could potentially count on the Empire to help him out. And again, if the High Elves ever manage to pull their spiky heads out of their massively cavernous anuses, and realizing that diplomacy might be a good idea, he might be able to rely on the Empire to provide the numbers that the High Elves do not possess for a final war against the Dark Elves, although you can be assured that the Dark Elves will be doing everything they can to make sure that such a diplomatic accord does not come into existence. As for the army organization of the High Elves and how their system of citizen militia works, I'll touch upon that in my army video, which will be coming up very, very shortly. Until then, I hope you've been enjoying this lore video of the High Elves, and I hope it's been at least somewhat informative. Again, if you'd like more in-depth information, I strongly suggest you head up over to the Lexicanum and take a look there, because there is just far too much lore for me to actually cover in any one video. But the Lexicanum is a wonderful place to find information about any of the factions that you might be interested in, and you just need to not be intimidated by the wall of text. But if you're able to sit through my rather lengthy videos, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day. Greetings and salutations.